Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the program where we try to compress some monumental historical and theological material into clear, accessible insight for you.
Today, we're undertaking a really critical deep dive. We are looking into the historical, literary, and theological life of the Apostle Paul.
And we're going to focus our analysis on what many consider his central and most systematic writing, the Epistle to the Romans.
When we talk about Paul, the scale of his contribution is it's enormous.
It really is. We're not just talking about historical influence here.
No, we're talking about him shaping the very structure of the church itself, providing a huge chunk of the New Testament.
And if you count his indirect influence, you could even include Luke's writings and maybe Hebrews.
On top of that, Paul gave us the most powerful, systematic expression of Christian doctrine ever formulated.
It's hard to overstate it. And what makes that colossal influence so striking is the paradox right at the heart of his story.
The central historical marvel is this. Here was a man of immense genius and heroic willpower who spent his youth in fanatical hatred of the early Christian movement.
He was trying to exterminate it.
Actively. He was Christianity's most efficient, brilliant enemy.
Precisely. And yet, this man Saul was suddenly converted into Christ's most active apostle and witness.
This victory, this transformation, it stands as a defining sign of Christianity's capacity to conquer the world.
It's not just that a persecutor converted.
No, it's the stature of the person who converted. The power of Christ took the most formidable opponent and fashioned him into the most victorious agency for conquest.
It's the ultimate turnaround story, but it's all anchored in divine intervention.
Saul became Paul. And that one biographical detail just encapsulates the whole drama of salvation history.
So before we get into the letters themselves, we really need to understand the man who wrote them.
Yeah, Paul wasn't just a randomly selected tool. He had this tricultural foundation that made him uniquely suited to be the apostle to the nations.
He could speak to everyone.
He could speak to Jews, Greeks, and Romans, and often he'd use their own legal or philosophical frameworks to do it.
Okay, so let's unpack that tricultural identity. Where does it start?
It begins with his birthplace, Tarsus.
The capital of Cilicia.
Right, situated on the Cydnus River. And Tarsus was known as a polished, venerable city, famous for its cultivated schools.
I've heard they rivaled Athens or Alexandria.
They did. So even if he came from a strict Pharisaic family, he was immersed in the Hellenic world from birth.
You can't escape that kind of environment.
No. And though his parents likely shielded him from direct Hellenistic studies, his vigorous mind certainly became privately acquainted with Greek philosophy and rhetoric.
And you see the fruit of that later.
Absolutely. You see his mastery of Greek logic, his ability to quote poets, and that detailed rhetorical analysis of Gentile corruption in Romans chapter 1.
So he wasn't just dropping popular phrases.
No, he spoke the language of Greek intellectual thought.
So that's the Hellenic side. Then there's the Roman element, which is so critical for his mobility, for his work.
That's the second component, his Roman civil status.
And this wasn't just because he lived in Tarsus.
No, his parents or ancestors had acquired citizenship under special conditions, and this status was a massive advantage for him.
It gave him legal dignity
And protection and safe passage across the vast Roman road network. So when Paul needed to assert his rights against illegal treatment, he had the watchword, Civis Romanus Sum.
I am a Roman citizen.
It was his passport for worldwide missions.
And finally, the third piece. He was Jewish, but not just nominally Jewish.
No, he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin.
And he received the most rigorous education possible.
In Jerusalem, under the conservative Pharisee Gamaliel, known reverentially as the glory of the law.
So that gave him this intimate expertise in the Old Testament.
The Old Testament, the vast rabbinical traditions, and the dialectical skills needed to argue the scriptures against any Jewish opponent he might face.
So let's put it all together. He's a cosmopolitan Roman citizen, he's educated in Greek rhetoric, and he's a highly trained rabbinical theologian.
It sounds like the perfect synthesis for a universal apostleship.
It really was. He had every natural qualification needed to bridge the ancient world's major national and intellectual elements.
And we should probably add one more practical detail.
His trade.
His trade. Like many young Jewish men, he learned a trade. He was a skanapios, a tent maker.
Which means he was probably weaving the coarse cloth used for tents.
That's the idea. He was a cultivated scholar who could also work a manual trade, a skill that supported him throughout his missionary career.
So the stage is set with this incredible individual, But his whole vocation changes abruptly on the road to Damascus.
It does. Before that, though, we first encounter Saul at the execution of Stephen.
And he was fully on board with the persecution.
Completely. Seeing Stephen's martyrdom seems to have just galvanized his zeal. He became a Sanhedrin's agent, actively scattering the Jerusalem congregation.
But when scattering them only caused the gospel to spread further.
To places like Antioch and Damascus.
He was furious.
And he solicited official letters to go destroy the Christian flock in Damascus.
And that desperation, that active persecution, that's what leads to the defining moment of his life.
His conversion near Damascus was a sudden, miraculous intervention by the glorified Christ. We shouldn't think of it as some gradual change of heart.
No, it was a victory of conversion and judgment all at once.
A direct encounter with the resurrected Lord that is, well, it's inexplicable without the factual resurrection of Christ.
The sheer contrast is what grabs you. He was the most zealous advocate for Pharisaic legalism, believing that following the law precisely was the route to righteousness.
And suddenly, he becomes the chief apostle of a free gospel, of justification by faith alone.
This contrast is just unparalleled in history.
It is. The glorified Christ took his most dangerous enemy and turned him into the most successful agent for spiritual conquest.
It really proves that the gospel's ability to save isn't dependent on the moral goodness of the recipient,
but on the sovereign call of God.
But the scripture suggests he didn't immediately launch his public ministry right after that blinding flash of light.
No, and this is a critical detail, one that's often overlooked by people who just focus on the dramatic road scene.
Right.
Following his initial enthusiasm in Damascus, he actually withdrew to Arabia for about 3 years.
And the Bible draws a veil over this time.
It does. It suggests it was spent in quiet contemplation and training.
So why was the silence necessary?
Well, think of it as a parallel to the original 12 apostles. They spent 3 years in external historical communion with Jesus.
And Paul missed that time.
He missed it. So he needed his own internal mysterious period of training. A man of his intellectual and spiritual might who had just experienced such a radical reversal. He required time to assimilate the reality of Christ and develop his doctrine.
His initial zeal might have been too stormy, as some sources suggest.
It would have been. This retreat allowed him to solidify his calling and his theology directly from revelation before he went out to engage the world.
And that Damascus Road experience, channeled through 3 years of quiet preparation, set up 2 millennia of theological influence.
It really did. Paul's doctrine, focusing on grace and the new creation, was so powerful that even as the church moved into the forms of ancient Catholicism, his spirit just didn't disappear.
You see this most clearly in Augustine.
Definitely. Augustine's own struggles with human will and sin led him straight back to Romans. And he built the first systematic doctrinal system of the renovated church, the Loci Communes, drawing heavily from Paul's insights.
And then even more dramatically, Paul's doctrine burst forth later as the central organizing principle of evangelical Protestantism.
The Reformation. It wasn't just a political or social event. It was a doctrinal rebirth rooted directly in the fundamental truths of Romans and Galatians.
Justification by faith alone, apart from works.
The Reformers essentially found in Paul the answer to the legalism that had become so entrenched in the church structure.
And when you consider the sheer scale of the output, I mean, Paul's epistles themselves, second only to the Gospels, stand as the most impactful literary production in history.
And they were written amidst anxiety and persecution, yet they contain such health, clarity, and vigor about the highest truths of human life and aspiration.
It's tempting to read Paul's letters as just a single block of doctrine, but it's much more illuminating to read them chronologically.
Oh, absolutely. It's like tracing a spiritual river. You see how his doctrine reacted and developed in response to specific challenges across the empire.
Viewing them chronologically shows us Paul, the thinker, refining his message based on the urgent needs and heresies he was facing in, Corinth, Galatia, Ephesus, Rome. So let's start at the beginning of that chronology, which are generally accepted as the earliest New Testament epistles.
The consensus points to the 2 epistles to the Thessalonians.
Written from Corinth.
From Corinth around AD 54 or 55 during his second missionary journey.
And what defines those letters? What's their main theme?
They're characterized by an eschatological focus. The Thessalonian Christians were facing persecution, and there was this intense concern, sometimes it's called chiliastic excitement, about the immediate second coming of Christ.
So they needed clarity.
Yeah, they needed to know what happened to believers who died before Christ's return and what signs to watch for. So Paul writes to comfort them and to provide some order regarding the end times.
And from eschatology, he moves pretty quickly into the crisis of salvation itself.
Which brings us to the great soteriological epistles.
Right.
The crisis begins with Galatians, written around AD 56-57 from Ephesus. This letter is polemical. It's a fiery defense of the gospel against Judaizing false teachers.
So he's fighting for the core idea of free grace.
Intensely. It focuses on the righteousness of faith in direct opposition to the Judaistic righteousness based on ritual works.
And then the masterpiece, Romans, written in AD 59 from Corinth, it's also soteriological, but it approaches the problem differently.
Very differently. Romans is constructed on a much broader, more systematic basis. Well, if Galatians is a sharp dagger aimed at Judaizing errorists, Romans is a heavy siege weapon.
I like that analogy.
It addresses the universal antagonism between grace and the righteousness of faith across the entire human race, Gentiles and Jews alike. It establishes the universal need and the universal remedy in a formalized structure. It's a doctrinal constitution, not a crisis management letter.
So once he's settled that foundational question of how a person is saved, Paul shifts his focus.
He does. He moves to the practical life of the church and the nature of Christ's relationship to it.
And that leads us into ecclesiastical and Christological development.
Right. The Corinthians epistles, written around AD 58, are ecclesiastical. They address concrete issues of congregational life.
Internal disturbances, divisions.
Moral corruptions, doctrinal issues like the resurrection. And then a second epistle focuses on defending his ministerial office against personal opponents.
And then we have the letters written from his first imprisonment in Rome, Ephesians, and Colossians.
AD 62-64. And they take on a distinctly Christological focus.
And the distinction between the two is instructive.
It is. Colossians deals with errorists who are trying to insert intermediary spiritual beings, maybe angels, between God and humanity.
And Paul responds by stressing Christ as the archer.
The principle or origin of all life, both in creation and redemption. The point is, Christ is sufficient.
And Ephesians looks at the end point.
Yes, Ephesians focuses on Christ as the telos, the glorified head. It's about the completion of God's purpose, gathering all things, Jew and Gentile, into unity under Christ as the church.
So Colossians looks at Christ as the beginning.
And Ephesians looks at him as the unified consummation.
Finally, we have his last instructions, the pastoral epistles.
Right. Assuming this strong tradition of a release and a second imprisonment is true.
Which it seems to be.
The pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy and Titus, they fall in the interval between those two captivities, around AD 64-66.
And these are regulatory letters.
They are. They're providing apostolic guidance for church government, how to appoint elders and deacons, handle finances, and manage growing heresies like the early forms of Ebionism and Judaizing Gnosticism. They assume a more settled, yet threatened church organization.
And his actual final written word.
Second Timothy. Written around AD 67 during his final Roman captivity. It's his last letter, a personal appeal to his spiritual son, Timothy, and he's anticipating his own martyrdom.
So it's designed as an apostolic rule and a legacy.
A legacy for Timothy's continued pastoral conduct, instructing him on how to succeed Paul and remain faithful until the very end.
Okay, now that we've placed Romans doctrinally and chronologically, we can focus on why Rome itself was the perfect destination for this systematic treatise.
Well, Rome was the great humanitarian metropolis, the center of the universal Roman monarchy.
And historically, it was a conquering force.
Right, it executed divine judgments upon the ancient world, but in doing so, it established the framework for the future Christian world. It was where the secular old world ended and the spiritual new world began.
So it was strategically necessary to establish Christian doctrine there.
Absolutely. Rome's unique mission was to facilitate the union of Jew and Gentile, bringing together theocratic faith and humanitarian culture, East and West, into what would eventually become the universal Catholic Church.
And Paul's letter was aimed at establishing the doctrinal foundation for that union.
Precisely.
We know Paul didn't start the church in Rome, but let's clarify the origins and maybe specifically address the tradition about Peter.
Sure. The sources confirm that the precise historical beginning of the Roman congregation is unknown.
The earliest seeds of the gospel were likely sown by Jews who were in Jerusalem for Pentecost.
As recorded in Acts chapter 2, yeah. And also those who were scattered after Stephen's martyrdom. The gospel arrived organically, without a famous apostle.
So the tradition that Peter founded the church and was its first bishop, which is a central argument for the historical papacy, is clearly contradicted by Paul's own words and the book of Acts.
It's a major historical conflict. Paul wrote Romans around 59 AD, based on his firm rule. He would not build on another man's foundation.
Right.
So the very fact that he felt he had the right to write such a detailed doctrinal epistle to Rome and planned to visit and use it as a missionary base, that proves it was still unassigned apostolic territory.
Meaning Peter was not yet the recognized head.
Exactly. And when Paul finally arrives in Rome, the evidence confirms this.
Around AD 62, as a prisoner.
Yes, and the Acts of the Apostles records him meeting with the leaders of the Jewish community, and there is absolutely no trace or mention of Peter being present or known to the Christians there.
Furthermore, Paul wrote several other epistles from Rome during his imprisonments,
including his final letter, Second Timothy, and Peter's never mentioned as being in authority or even present with him.
So if no major apostle started it, who was keeping the faith alive there before Paul arrived?
Well, though the church existed without Paul's direct cooperation, he did have pioneers who prepared the way for his visit.
Chief among them were Aquila and Priscilla,
a married couple who were Jewish Christians, but decidedly Pauline in their gospel understanding. Paul sends them his first greeting in chapter 16.
And they were influential enough to host a gathering of the Roman congregation in their house.
They were. This Pauline element, supported by such influential figures, was clearly strong, which gave Paul the confidence to address them in this doctrinal manner.
All right, let's nail down the facts of the letter's creation.
The date is pretty fixed. It's around the year 59 after Christ, during Paul's third missionary journey.
And the location was Corinth,
the bustling metropolis of Achaia.
How are we so sure about Corinth?
Well, we have several key internal clues that all converge on Corinth. First, Paul mentions he was preparing to depart for Jerusalem with the large collection he'd gathered from Macedonia and Achaia.
An event we know concluded in Corinth.
Right. Second, the letter was physically carried by the deaconess Phoebe from Cenchreae, which was the eastern seaport of Corinth. Third, Paul sends greetings from his host, Gaius, who was identified as a Corinthian, and from Erastus, the city treasurer of Corinth. It's an undeniable convergence of details.
And it's a good reminder that Paul didn't physically write this monumental work himself.
Correct. It was dictated by Paul to Tertius, his assistant or amanuensis, who inserts his own greeting at the end.
Paul was fully capable of writing Greek.
Oh, he was a highly educated Hellenist.
Right.
But dictation was common practice due to the scope of the letter and the availability of educated assistants. It allowed him to concentrate purely on the rigorous outpouring of his theological argument.
So what then was Paul's strategic goal in sending this comprehensive doctrinal treatise to a church he hadn't even met yet?
Romans acted as a kind of preliminary summary of Paul's universal missionary work.
It was designed to establish the specifically Pauline gospel.
Justification by faith in its full universal constitution. It was meant to take the place of his personal preaching and make his doctrine known to this important congregation.
So it was apostolic strategy, using Rome as a launch pad.
Precisely. The ultimate goal was twofold. First, to harmonize the Jewish and Gentile elements within the Roman Church, which were in frequent conflict over law and freedom.
And second,
to prepare the Roman Church to become the center and starting point for his missionary labors further west.
Specifically towards Spain.
Right, which represented the very limit of the known Western pagan world.
He needed Rome to be doctrinally sound and unified before he could use it as his base of operations.
It functioned as a measure of apostolic regulation for a church he hadn't founded. He had to demonstrate that his gospel, centered on free grace, was the only viable means of uniting Jewish and Gentile Christians into a single, cohesive community dedicated to the living worship of God.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to the magnificent theological structure of Romans itself. It moves with such relentless logic. Diagnosis, remedy, and application.
Yes. The argument unfolds in three main phases. The first is chapters 1 through 3, which establishes the absolute universal need for salvation.
Paul starts with the Gentiles, painting this brutal picture of universal corruption. What does he argue was their original sin, their starting point?
He says their fall began not with a violent action, but with a colossal failure, the peccatum omissimus.
Which means the sin of omission.
Right. They neglected the clear general revelation of God in nature, and they failed to offer true worship through praise and thanksgiving. They knew God existed, but they refused to honor him.
And because they suppressed that truth and refused to worship, God gave them over to something worse.
That's the crucial move. Because they neglected the living worship of God, God handed them over to judicial abandonment. And this led to a spiraling descent,
First, they turned to idolatry.
worshiping creation instead of the Creator. Then they were delivered to unnatural sins, and finally to a full, calculated development of vice, crime, and depravity.
Even taking pleasure when others committed sin. So the Gentile world is condemned because they refused to worship the God they saw reflected in creation. But the Jews had the written law, surely they are exempt.
Paul shuts that door immediately. He shows that the Jews, despite possessing the written law and the sign of circumcision, actually intensified their corruption through false zeal for the law and legalistic pride.
Their claim to righteousness became a shield for unrighteous behavior.
And the consequence of that legal pride, their conduct became so corrupted that their boasting in the law actually caused the Gentiles to blaspheme or think poorly of God's name.
They were relying on their status as covenant people while failing to live up to the holiness the law required.
The law became a source of pride rather than a mirror for their souls.
So what is the law's true purpose then?
The law's purpose is not to generate righteousness or pride, but to provide the knowledge of sin. It doesn't justify, it convicts.
It shows the extent of God's requirement, and by showing that requirement, exposes human failure.
So the Jewish advantage was only that they were given the divine declarations by which all humanity, Jew and Gentile, are equally represented as guilty, shut up under the penalty of sin.
The conclusion stands. Both are sinners, destitute of righteousness before God.
And this is Paul's non-negotiable conclusion. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The law is acknowledged and renewed by faith. It isn't thrown out, but it can never, ever justify a sinner. The road of works is a dead end for everyone.
So if the law doesn't provide the cure, Paul introduces the remedy in chapter 3. He calls it the righteousness of God. How should we understand this?
The righteousness of God is revealed without the law by faith in Christ. This is the central concept, and it means two things. First, it's God's own attribute of righteousness, now available. And second, it's the righteous status that God declares over the sinner.
And this status, this righteousness, is accessible to all sinners without distinction.
Precisely. Christ is the mediator, the propitiator. If you look at the Old Testament, the mercy seat in the temple was the place where the high priest sprinkled blood for atonement.
And Paul argues that Christ is the common mercy seat.
For pardon, accessible to all, because his atoning sacrifice satisfies the requirements of divine justice.
This idea, justification by faith alone, must have been revolutionary to the Jewish Christians in Rome.
It fundamentally reshapes identity. Justification by faith alone utterly removes human boasting and works righteousness.
It proves that God is the God of the Gentiles as well as the Jews.
Because salvation is a gift received by faith, not earned by nationality or ritual observance. The only required work is Christ's work on the cross.
And to give this doctrine historical weight, Paul uses the most revered figure in Judaism, Abraham.
The witness of Abraham is ingenious. Abraham was justified before he was circumcised. That is, he was justified as a heathen.
Right.
Circumcision came later as a seal of the justification he already possessed by faith. This makes Abraham the common father of faith for both Gentiles, who are uncircumcised believers, and Jews, who are circumcised believers.
And David is used in a similar way.
As a witness to the joy of having sins covered or righteousness imputed, not earned.
So once this righteousness is granted by faith, what are the immediate, tangible results?
The results are immediate and profound, as detailed in chapter 5. The first result is peace with God. The war between the sinner and the sovereign Creator is over.
Second, there is free access into grace.
Third, there is the ability to glory in hope. And surprisingly, even glorying in afflictions.
What affliction?
Well, afflictions, when viewed through the lens of justified hope, produce endurance, character, and they perfect the hope itself. They don't destroy hope, they refine it.
And this entire result, peace, access, and hope.
It constitutes the new worship of God, where the entire subsequent life is converted from the failure of omission into an active dedication of praise.
So now Paul transitions to sanctification. How does the initial act of justification translate into the ongoing reality of a new holy life? This is where that Adam-Christ comparison becomes so central.
Chapter 5 through 8 deals with sin and grace and their operating power within human nature. Paul sets up the contrast. Adam's sin introduced the principle of death and corruption to all humanity.
However, God's grace in Christ is the mightier principle of the new life,
Which brings about the kenotisis, a new spiritual creation.
He argues that the believer has undergone a fundamental shift in allegiance.
The Christian vocation is a change of masters. It's a transition from servitude under the letter of the law to the service of the Spirit under grace.
By being united with Christ's death and resurrection, symbolized in baptism.
Believers are considered dead to sin and dead to the law. The law no longer has jurisdiction over them as a system of condemnation.
But chapter 7 often confuses people, where Paul discusses his inner struggle, feeling trapped between his desire to do good and the evil he actually performs.
Chapter 7 is the crucial struggle. It shows that the law itself is holy and good, but when sin uses the law, it produces not life, but the knowledge of death.
The law awakens the sin principle within us,
Proving that we need liberation from the principle of sin itself, not just forgiveness for the acts of sin. The individual realizes that the law can only show them what is right. It cannot provide the power to do it.
And chapter 8 is the glorious resolution to that struggle.
It is. Chapter 8 presents the life lived under the law of the Spirit of life. The Spirit doesn't destroy the external law. It fulfills and elevates it. The Spirit is the operating agent, providing the power that the flesh lacked.
So the Spirit acts as the mediator of atonement.
And the witness of adoption, assuring us that we are children of God and guaranteeing future glory.
So the premise of chapter 8 is not just individual salvation, but something cosmological.
It is the guarantee that the believer will inherit future glory, elevating them to the liberation and glorification of the entire created order, which is currently subject to futility. The law of the Spirit is the blueprint for a new world of life and love, culminating in the believer's final deliverance.
Having established the salvation of the individual, Paul zooms out to the biggest theological problem, the fate of Israel. Why, if salvation is for the Jew first, have the majority of Israel rejected Christ?
This section, chapters 9, 10, and 11, it shifts focus entirely to the historical economy of salvation. Paul begins by expressing this intense personal anguish over Israel's situation, their failure to attain the salvation promised to them.
But he has to reconcile this failure with God's faithfulness to the covenant promises.
And he asserts immediately that the promise of God holds good for a chosen kernel, the elect. Not all descendants of Israel are truly Israel.
So God's promise isn't void.
No. Rather, only a portion of the nation was chosen for this role. And Paul uses the examples of Isaac and Jacob to show that God's choice, rooted in election, precedes human merit.
So if God holds up the promise for the elect kernel, why the mass unbelief among the rest?
Paul argues that the unbelief of the majority is not merely a fatalistic destiny. It results from the antagonism between their stubborn self-righteousness,
Their zealous attempts to establish their own righteousness based on strict observance of the law.
and the true righteousness that comes only by faith in Christ. They stumbled over the rock of offense because they refused to submit to God's chosen method of justification.
They mistook the law, which was meant to lead them to Christ, as an end in itself.
Precisely. They sought righteousness by works, instead of realizing that righteousness is a gift received through faith.
This leads to one of the most surprising twists in all of Paul's writings. The failure of Israel wasn't just a failure, it was instrumental in a larger divine plan.
This is the economy of hardening. Paul reveals that the hardening of the hearts of the majority of Israel becomes a necessary condition for the conversion of the Gentiles.
So if Israel had accepted Christ immediately,
They might have retained an exclusive cultural identity that prevented the gospel from flowing freely to the non-Jewish world. God restricted salvation temporarily from one group to allow it to spread universally.
so Israel's fall became the world's gain.
Yes, their transgression became the riches of the Gentiles, but the plan doesn't end there.
Paul shows the reciprocal effect.
The conversion of the Gentiles is intended, in turn, to provoke Israel to jealousy.
So the Gentiles' faith acts as a catalyst.
The sight of masses of Gentiles entering God's kingdom through faith is intended to shock and provoke the Israelites, eventually leading to the conversion of all Israel.
He envisions a future time when Israel as a whole will be grafted back into the olive tree.
After the full number of Gentiles has come in.
It's an intricate mechanism where God uses judgment and rejection as temporary means for a much greater universal rescue.
The entire design is just stunning. It shows the intimate connection between God's acts of judgment and his eventual acts of rescue, demonstrating that all events,
The initial rejection, the Gentile influx,
and the final restoration of Israel will contribute to the eventual and spectacular glory of God.
This entire discussion culminates in a powerful declaration praising the depth of God's wisdom and knowledge. His ways are unsearchable, but they lead to restoration.
Paul never lets his theology stay abstract. Having laid out the diagnosis, the cure, and the divine plan, he moves immediately in chapter 12 to the question of practical living. He shifts from doctrine to duty. The logic is clear. Because God has justified you and incorporated you into this grand historical plan, your life must reflect a corresponding new way of living.
The key practical theme introduced is the call to represent the living worship of God. What does Paul mean by dedicating our bodies as living sacrifices?
This is the direct counterpoint to the peccatum omissimus we discussed earlier, the initial fall of man caused by the omission of true worship and thanksgiving.
So the living sacrifice is the opposite.
It is. It means dedicating your entire existence, your mind, your behavior, your relationships, as an active offering of praise and thanks. Your life, not a ritual on an altar, becomes the true spiritual service.
And this application immediately extends beyond the four walls of the church community. Paul addresses external relations, including civil government.
This is a critical text on Christian universalism and conduct. Paul affirms that temporal authority, even the pagan Roman state, has a recognized liturgical and official function in God's household.
The state is a minister of God, even if the magistrate doesn't recognize that fact.
Right. And he defines the state's role as exercising justice, punishing wrongdoing, and maintaining order. It's subservient to God's highest aim, which is the ultimate glory of God through Christ.
So Christians are called to submit to temporal authority not out of fear,
but out of recognition that the government has been instituted by God for the good of society.
Now Paul addresses the immediate internal challenge in Rome, the conflict between Jewish and Gentile believers concerning cultural practices.
This is chapter 14, where Paul manages the differences between the weak and the strong.
The weak were likely Jewish Christians.
Entangled in legalistic anxieties over eating meat sacrificed to idols or observing fast days. The strong were Gentile Christians who understood their freedom in Christ, but might have abused that freedom by viewing the anxieties of their Jewish brothers with contempt.
So the issue isn't theological doctrine, but ethical practice rooted in conscience.
Absolutely. The rule Paul establishes is not dogmatic enforcement of one position over the other. It is ethical unity built on reciprocal regard and forbearance.
The strong should not despise the weak, and the weak should not judge the strong.
And the ultimate ethical rule he imposes is reciprocal edification in self-denial.
So we must aim to build each other up.
And we do so by imitating Christ, who did not live to please himself. If exercising a freedom causes a brother to stumble or violate his conscience, then love dictates that the strong restrain their freedom. Love and unity become the practical fulfillment of the law in communal life.
In the final chapters, Paul wraps up the letter, justifying his authority and finalizing his travel plans.
He justifies his boldness in writing such a comprehensive letter to a church he hadn't founded by emphasizing his specific divine calling.
To make the heathen an acceptable offering to God.
He sees his missionary work as a priestly function, offering converted Gentiles to God.
And he reaffirms his grand missionary roadmap here.
He confirms that he has concluded his work in the East, having spread the gospel as far as Illyria, modern-day Albania.
And his sights are now fixed on the West.
He announces his plan to proceed to Spain, the furthest limit of the Western pagan world, viewing Rome only as a necessary hospitable stop and the point of departure for that next stage of his mission.
The letter ends with organizational details and a profound final sealing.
It does. He concludes with necessary introductions, recommending the deaconess Phoebe who carried the letter, and issues sharp warnings against separatistic heretics who might disrupt Rome's unity.
And the entire letter culminates in a beautiful liturgical declaration.
The doxology in chapter 16. It is Paul's triumphant final sealing of the gospel of justifying grace for all nations, recognizing that God will receive eternal glory through Jesus Christ, the one who brings the mystery of the ages to light.
To summarize this immense deep dive, Paul functioned as the theological architect who codified the doctrine of free grace in the Epistle to the Romans.
He systematically proved that universal sin requires a singular remedy justification by faith alone, establishing the essential foundation for the union of all nations, Jew and Gentile, in the universal church.
And for you, the listener, the insight lies in the systematic, step-by-step nature of this letter. Romans is not random inspiration. It's a detailed blueprint for understanding Paul's theology.
It shows precisely how justification by faith in Christ dictates every aspect of Christian life, from individual sanctification and community ethics, all the way up to God's vast, sweeping historical plan for Israel and the Gentile world.
So if we leave you with one idea to consider, Paul, the great defender against legalism, foresaw the need to write his most comprehensive treatise specifically to Rome.
The city destined to become the capital of medieval Catholicism, which later struggled mightily with his core doctrine of justification by faith. what current cultural or religious institutions might today stand in need of reading Paul's epistle to the Romans again, receiving its challenge to abandon human effort for divine grace.
That gives us plenty to contemplate. Until next time on Reformed Thinking.